Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sean McMeekin. He is Francis Flournoy Professor of European History and Culture at Bard College, and today we're going to talk about his book, To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. So, Dr. McMeekin, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Oh, thank you for having me, Ricardo. It's great to be here.
So, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, it's actually easier to answer that question than it might ordinarily be. I can almost date it to a conversation I had several years ago at the height of the COVID lockdowns with an English historian friend of mine called Nick Lloyd, who writes a lot on the First World War. He's doing a trilogy at the moment. Western Front, Eastern Front have both come out, and he's going to do another history of the Middle Eastern Front. And we've worked together at times or spoken together at events over the years, and we were just jawboning back and forth about the lockdowns and the travel restrictions and the mask mandates and all these other things, and how difficult it was to do anything or travel or go anywhere or do research or even see people. And we started musing aloud whether this might have been what it was like under communism. And he said, why don't you write a history of communism? And so there it is. No, the reason, the broader, I suppose, cause, the longer term cause, you might say, instead of the proximate cause of my tackling the subject, is that I've been working on aspects of the history of communism on and off for many years, where I actually kind of began my career as a historian. Way back in the 1990s, I grew up against the backdrop of the fall of the Soviet Union. It was in the headlines, fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the USSR. So from a very early age, I was always fascinated by the subject, and it's really where I first kind of cut my teeth as a historian, doing a lot of research in Moscow in the old communist archives, which always had an interesting frisson to me. The secrets, the buried secrets, suddenly laid bare, even if some of those archives, unfortunately, are closing up again. So I'd been working on and off on the subject for years, and it just kind of struck me. I mean, why not try to do a kind of a general summing up of what we know? Also because, and I think that's really the angle of the book, the subtitle about the rise and fall and rise of communism, is that 20 or 30 years ago, I think many of us in the West had this idea, well, goodbye to all that. Thank goodness that's all finished. There's even a book by Richard Pipes, a historian I admire, but who tried to sum up history of communism about 25 years ago by saying he was writing its obituary, that is, that it was dead and buried and behind us. And I'm not quite sure that's the case. So I thought the story deserved a new treatment from a new perspective, not least because a lot of history has passed since we first thought that communism was dead and buried.
So we won't have time to go through even the main and most important events in the history of communism here, but let's try to at least cover some of them. What would you say are the origins of communism?
Well, one could go back very far. And in the book, I talk about certain antecedents, even in the history of Christianity, in the history of Greco-Roman philosophy. Obviously, one can go back as far as one wants to trace the kind of ideal of equality between men, or at least the equality of all souls, the equality of all believers in the Christian tradition, notions of charity and the renunciation of material wealth. But I think the story really starts to come together in a big way in the 18th century. Some combination of not necessarily the mainstream French Enlightenment thinkers, but Rousseau is an obvious one that people sometimes talk about, even though he didn't go quite as far as laying out a vision of forcible social equality in the material sense. He certainly talked in the Social Contract about the idea of a radically egalitarian political community where all citizens are equal, and then effectively those who are not citizens are put outside the community and can even be put to death. It was a lesser known Enlightenment thinker called Etienne Morley, who was writing at the same time of Rousseau, who actually spelled out much more explicitly, and his inspiration was quite literally Christian. He thought the greatest sin basically was greed or avarice, and so the only way to produce a kind of a truly existing Christianity would be to eradicate all material inequality, to have a radical community of egalitarianism with even strict rationing of all material goods. Now, a lot of people would say this is a heresy of what Christianity was meant to be, but his inspiration clearly was Christian. I mean, this comes out of the Western Christian eschatological tradition, almost the idea of a final judgment. The story really starts to pick up, though, with a political activist who was inspired by part Rousseau, but really more morally in his vision of extreme social equality. That was Gracchus Babeuf. Francois Noël Babeuf was his original name. He took the name Gracchus as a kind of nom de guerre during the French Revolution. He was an interesting figure who, as a kind of a law clerk managing manorial property roles, the old tradition of mortmain, the literal inequality of the old French system with the three estates and the aristocracy and so forth, with the various obligations peasants had to their lords. He knew a lot about the kind of nitty-gritty of inequality in old regime France, and that part was fair enough. He wanted reform, but he went much further. Basically, once they got rid of these laws, he was kind of out of a job, so he became a political activist. And drawing on his reading of these radical Enlightenment thinkers, he decided in the end that the revolution hadn't gone far enough. You know, even the Rousseauian version of the terror under Robespierre, when people outside the political community were being put to death as enemies of the people, effectively, that still wasn't far enough. You know, they had to go even further, and they had to have forcible social equality with the confiscation of property. What was interesting about this, and the reason it inspired Marx and Lenin and later revolutionaries, was that he was quite upfront about what it required. He's not saying, like, in some airy-fairy utopian sense, we can just wave our magic wands and suddenly everyone will be equal. No, he said this is going to require radical cleansing political violence, literal explicit talk about putting enemies to death, and those who resist will be put to death and they will be exterminated and all the rest of it, realizing that to eradicate inequality, you would literally need to, of course, rob people, confiscate wealth, nationalize property, put it all in the hands of some revolutionary committee. Never really quite got to the details of what things were supposed to look like afterwards, but the vision, and this is the thing I think some people get wrong. Some people think that, you know, communists are all necessarily idealists in some sense of, like, maybe even pacifism, or they think that, you know, they're against violence. No, the violence is a huge part of both the ideology, but also I honestly think of the attraction. You know, I think that a lot of people are attracted to this precisely because it offers this vision of kind of radical cleansing political violence. Certainly that appealed to Marx. You look through all this rhetoric, you know, he's quite explicit about this. The only chance Marx ever had to sort of say, look, what might it look like in practice? Not necessarily the final vision of communism, but rather the rupture, the power seizure, was the Paris Commune of 1871 in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War. And a lot of people thought, because the communards were not necessarily strict Marxists or strict communists, they hadn't necessarily read the Communist Manifesto, they didn't endorse all of its kind of bullet point programs, the program of the Communist Manifesto, which was quite explicit about the eradication of private property, the centralization of credit in the banks, the nationalization of agriculture, all the rest of it. They weren't, you know, very good doctrinaire communists, but nonetheless, they had this radical vision and they wanted to overturn the order, and they put a lot of people to death. And so some people thought Marx should distance himself from it, but quite the opposite. He said, no, absolutely. You know, this is how you do it. And even if it's imperfect, you know, you kind of kill a lot of people, you create this radical vision. And even if you fail, then this is an inspiration to others who will get it, you know, get it right the next time. That the political violence is really an essential part of the story. You know, even Marx even said, like, they complained that women and children were thrown into battle and killed, or they complained that they executed these innocent bourgeois hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris. They burned down buildings. Marx said, absolutely, you must do all those things. You know, arson is fine. Executions of class enemies, fine. Women and children in battle, mass cleansing violence, it's all great. Then Lenin takes it even further, you know, and he's learning kind of on the fly from Marx in his career and from history. And so he learns that, first of all, the best chance for a revolution is in the course of a war, Franco-Prussian War, and later on the First World War, the Russo-Japanese War. So he calls that revolutionary defeatism. And that part I've talked about in a lot of other books. The part that I talked a little bit more explicitly about in this book was that Lenin also even spelled out how he thought it would happen and what would come next in this relatively little known but important pamphlet called The Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution, which he wrote in 1916 during the First World War. A lot of other people are kind of recoiling from the violence of the First World War. Oh, it's awful. Let's end the war. No, Lenin said, no, this is exactly what we need. We turn the imperialist war into a civil war. You get guns into the hands of the soldiers. They will then become class warriors. You'll get this apocalyptic class war, class revolution. They'll turn their guns against their oppressors, against their officers. You'll have mass mutinies and civil war and mass violence. And then once the communists are in power in one country, they'll be in a state of opposition to all the non-communist countries. And so then you'll get wars between the communist countries and the non-communist countries. And basically this whole kind of endless series of spiraling violence and war. And he wasn't saying, I hope this doesn't happen. He was saying, I hope it does happen. That's exactly what he wanted to happen. And he even cited Marx on this business about, well, yes, we will need to throw women and children into battle. And so even like what you would see later with the Red Guards in China and that sort of thing, children being thrown into battle, that's all right there already in Marx and Lenin.
Right. So let's then talk a little bit about the first rise of communism that you refer to in the subtitle of your book. So what led first to the Russian revolution? How did it happen?
Well, a lot of it had to do, of course, with Lenin and his particular vision that I've already talked about, but he would not have been able to achieve any of this without a fortunate series of circumstances breaking his way. I mean, what did make Lenin effective, were two things. One, again, is he saw the war as an opportunity. I mean, they had this interesting debate in what was called the Second International before the First World War. This is the Second Working Men's International Association. Marx had founded the first in 1864. The second was founded in Paris in 1889. And the great tragedy, at least from the perspective of kind of more sympathetic historians of the left or socialists or communists, was always that, they got it wrong. They had some good ideas, but they didn't carry them through. What they had tried to do, and they talked about the idea of a Massenstrike or a general strike, was that once there might be a war between the so-called capitalist powers or the imperialist powers, that, the workers, the ones who were kind of mining the coal and building the weapons and forging the metal, they could all stop working, and this would kind of prevent the war. And, Lenin kind of bandied around the idea along with some others, but in the end, he actually thought there was a better idea, which is basically, look, if the war is going to happen, it's going to happen. So you take advantage of it. You seize the moment. So this is this revolutionary defeatism I was talking about, but basically spreading mass mutinies. There's a slogan, turning the imperialist war into a civil war. So first of all, the First World War has to happen for this even to become possible or practicable. There had been a little bit of a dry run in Russia in 1904, 1905 during the Russo-Japanese War. And Lenin had realized in the course of that war, he didn't play much of a role in the revolution. He was mostly in exile in those years and kind of came back to Russia at the last minute and didn't really do even as much as Trotsky and a few others. But he was very good at reading the events, which was that Russia lost the war. Japan very clearly defeated Russia, sneak attack on Port Arthur in the Pacific, followed by a series of land battles, the siege, and then this great naval battle at Tsushima. Russia was absolutely humiliated in that war, particularly because it was a kind of non-European power, and this is the age when the Europeans really thought that they were still superior, whether in racial, cultural, civilizational sense to non-European people. So it was a huge wake-up call, a huge embarrassment, a humiliation of the Russian government, and it nearly got toppled in a revolution in 1905. The Tsar had to back down, made concessions. So-called October Manifesto, he allows for the first time a real parliament called the Duma in Russia, the various concessions. Basically, the point being, Russia backed down. It didn't go quite far enough from Lenin's perspective, but the fact was that losing a war is what made it possible. Now, during the First World War, and Lenin's mostly in exile in Switzerland under effectively the protection of the Central Powers, who saw him as a potential useful ally, was the Austrians, not the Germans. The Austrians first sent him to Switzerland. It's the Germans who later send him to Russia, those being the Central Powers at war with the so-called Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. So because Lenin was this kind of sworn enemy of the Tsar and of the Russian Tsarist regime, he was seen as useful by the Central Powers. Lenin, for his own part, both used this as an opportunity, but then he also theorized, and he was quite explicit about it, that what he wanted to do was to bring about the defeat of his own country. And he even used one's own country in kind of inverted quote marks. That is, he's an anti-patriot. He wants his country to lose the war because that way the government will be humiliated, weakened, its prestige cratered, etc. So then you can strike and you can overthrow the government. And he proceeds to do this quite literally in 1917. Again, initially he's in exile. The Tsar is toppled in this revolution, the so-called February Revolution. The Tsar abdicates. It's a complicated story, and Lenin has very little to do with it. A lot of this had to do with kind of internal Russian politics, and obviously there was a lot of dissatisfaction. There were a lot of also opportunists. The thing about the February Revolution, I think a lot of people get wrong, is they think it was this kind of upwelling of anti-war sentiment. was almost the opposite. In fact, most of the dissatisfaction with the Tsar, particularly in Russian high society and in kind of the rumor mongering and so on that was making people paranoid and riling them up, was the idea that, in fact, the Tsarist regime was kind of honeycombed with pro-German traitors. You know, that's what the whole Rasputin affair was about, that Rasputin was seen as a kind of a pro-German traitor, and that's why he had to be killed. And he literally was killed by a member of the Tsar's own family and a high-born Russian aristocrat called Felix Yusupov. They were doing it because they wanted to get the pro-German Black Bloc clique out of the way. You know, they wanted to prosecute the war. In fact, even the key generals at headquarters, Stavka, who in the end sort of, they didn't greenlight the revolution exactly, but they convinced the Tsar to abdicate because they believed that it would help Russia win the war. Anyway, long story short, the February Revolution is not anti-war. There's a lot of misunderstanding, but basically a lot of the key figures are actually pro-war. They want to continue the war. Even Kerensky, who emerges as the kind of radical but not quite communist figure, he comes from this party called the Socialist Revolutionary Party. They were not Marxists. They were more of a peasant-based party, was actually pro-war. He wanted to kind of prosecute the war. But it becomes increasingly difficult over the course of the spring and the summer. And some of this is just war weariness, which is natural after the First World War had been burning for 3 years. But what happens is that Lenin is allowed to return to Russia. He's sent there by the Germans who want to undermine the Russian war effort. Now, Lenin, of course, is using the Germans in the same way they're using him. They kind of line up on this question. The Germans want Russia to lose the war. Lenin wants Russia to lose the war. And so Lenin works to help Russia lose the war. He has German money. This allows him to buy up a printing press, cash on the barrelhead, and then they start flooding the armies. First, just the rear guard units in Petrograd, Petersburg, later Leningrad, the capital then. And then the units nearby, the Baltic Fleet. Eventually, by about summer, they finally reach kind of the frontline armies right as Kerensky is ordering this offensive in Galicia and kind of the contested area between Austria-Hungary and Russia. And so you get this almost bonfire of the mutinies, where there's a mutiny back in Petrograd that we refer to as the July Days. There are mutinies near the front, all of it fueled by communist propaganda. Again, Lenin is literally promoting mutinies. That's pretty much the program. That's what the story of what would later be the October Revolution is about. It's kind of like this gigantic mutiny. You know, even the Red Guards, who later are the kind of muscle that helped Lenin achieve power first in the capital and then in other cities, nearly all of them are either disaffected soldiers or they're deserters, or some of them are even active duty members of the Tsarist Imperial Army, the former Tsarist Imperial Army, now fighting for the so-called provisional government, or the Imperial Navy, which is mostly in the Baltic, which is quite critical in the story because it's so close to Petrograd. Particularly, there's a base nearby on Kotlin Island, Kronstadt. There's a base in Helsinki. So these mutinies are actively promoted by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So in the initial sense, that's sort of what the communist program, at least for seizing power, is. And Lenin is quite explicit about this. He's reading Clausewitz. He's obsessed with kind of military affairs, and it's all about force. Like, how many men do we have under arms? How many men do they have under arms? Stalin would later turn this almost into an aphorism when he was once asked about the Pope, the Vatican, and you said something like, well, yeah, how many divisions does the Pope have? In other words, it's like literally you're getting arms in the hands of these kind of impressionable, violent young men and making sure you have more men under arms than the enemy. And that's, in the end, what they did. Kerensky plays a lot of things wrong. There's a thing called the Kornilov affair where he crosses swords with basically the commander-in-chief of the armies. Incredibly stupid. Forfeited the support of the officer corps. He weakened critically any support his regime had in the army. So then in the end, most of the army sort of almost just, they were neutral. They kind of played dead during what would be called the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks seized power. And then, it was not as violent as it might have been in Petrograd, because there they had already so thoroughly propagandized the rearguard units. In Moscow and a few other cities, they actually had to fight their way into power. And there's, they're literally like shelling the Kremlin. It's a very violent power seizure across Russia, which then dovetails with this kind of gigantic demobilization of the army. Basically, it's like a mutiny. But what they wanted, this is also part of Lenin's program, is he wanted the army to be demobilized, but he wanted the soldiers to leave with their arms so that they could then, be enrolled in either the Red Guards or the Red Army. In the end, they had to kind of make a few compromises. They had to bring back a few of the old officers because they realized they didn't know how to run an army. And eventually they even brought back the death penalty, which initially they had opposed when the soldiers were loyal to the old regime. So it's really a story about kind of mutiny, propaganda, the army. But in the end, what they needed to do is to get arms into the hands of impressionable young men. And that was only possible because of the war.
And later, how did communism go international? How did it spread from Russia to China and other countries?
Well, some of the ideas are spread through, of course, propaganda through communist parties, which were funded by Moscow. Again, some of the ideas were already out there, but the particular vision that the Comintern, the Communist International, wanted to impose on parties, the so-called party line, that was devised in Moscow, and then that was buttressed and supported by agents, emissaries, funds. The Comintern had a central kind of treasury. Oddly enough, the currency that they kept accounts in was the US dollar, ironically. The official language was actually German. But the whole thing was run out of Moscow. And so, they tell these communist parties all over the world, they're totally funded by Moscow. They have these rules. They're called the 21 Conditions for Membership. They spell this all out. The parties are supposed to have these kind of shadow governments ready to seize power. Now, in practice, it didn't usually happen that way. I mean, a lot of the propaganda and a lot of the funds were probably wasted because in the end, although communists at times would make inroads in a few countries, like they had a few successes in Germany, but then things kind of went backwards. At times in France and Italy, they were quite popular, although they never quite sniffed power. Then in the 30s, there were popular front governments where the communists were kind of, again, close to, but not really quite having power. No, in the end, it required war, just like it had for Lenin. So you had a few episodes right after the First World War in places like Hungary and Germany, countries that, like Russia, had lost the war. And so, they had these kind of copycat Soviet-style communist revolutions, but they didn't last very long because, again, they hadn't gotten enough men under arms, and, they were defeated. It's very, very clear. They were defeated by arms. Spain, the Soviets were able to take over the so-called Popular Front government there for a couple of years from 36 to early 39, but they lose that war too. Again, they succeeded for a time. It was maybe longer lived than the revolutions in Hungary and Munich, but in the end, it didn't last long enough. It really is only after the Second World War that there's enough violence, there's enough chaos, there's enough destruction of the social order, and most of all, and this is the key bit, enough impressionable, angry young men are under arms who were able to start toppling governments. And so it comes out of civil wars. In the same way in Russia, they turned the imperialist war into a civil war. In Yugoslavia, kind of the Second World War becomes a civil war. In China, the war with Japan becomes a civil war. And in nearly all these cases, even if there were these kind of so-called native communist leaders, people like Josip Broz, codenamed Tito in Yugoslavia, or of course Mao Zedong in China, the two most famous so-called kind of self-made, it's usually seen like, oh, well, no, they actually achieved power on their own without Russian help. It's a total lie in both cases. Broz Tito was taking instructions from Moscow all along. He was a very loyal communist. He, oddly enough, got a lot of armed support during the war before the Soviets were able to start supplying him from Britain. And this is partly it's a story that it's a little bit delicate to talk about because so many people admire Winston Churchill, but he really kind of got played basically by some agents inside the British government and the BBC into believing that the person Britain should have been supporting, that basically the army fighting on behalf of the Yugoslav exile government in London, the Royal Yugoslav exile government in London that Britain was hosting and supporting, Mihailovich and the so-called Chetniks, he abandons them. He throws his support to Tito. Unbeknownst to Churchill, the whole time, Tito is actually sending these reports back about Churchill's envoy, a man named Fitzroy McLean. He's fully loyal to Stalin. In fact, even the so-called Tito-Stalin split that emerges after the Second World War is not because Tito was not a communist. Rather, it's because he was in some ways more communist than Stalin. For example, Tito wanted to spread communism to Greece, whereas Stalin was at least willing to accept Churchill's deal, the kind of percentages agreement that Greece was in Britain's sphere of influence, so he wouldn't bother there. Tito, in some ways, was actually more of a revolutionary communist than, Stalin, at least tactically, when it came to various countries around Europe. Now, Mao, it's true, was ornery, and eventually he would break in a more serious way, probably because he had, larger population, more resources. He would eventually break with the Soviets in the late 1950s. But when he came to power, he was absolutely loyal to the Soviet Union. They had been funding him all the way back since 1921. The Long March, so-called Long March, all the elements in the Mao legend. If you actually look at the evidence, he is very much under instructions from Moscow. Even the reason Mao is able to survive the war with Japan, the Sino-Japanese War, which we can roughly date from 1937 to 45, even if Japan had already occupied Manchuria back in 1931. Mao's forces did not fight Japan because Stalin brokered a deal for him with Japan. And so, again, it was a perfect kind of setup for Mao. Japan and then the Chinese nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek could kind of destroy each other. And then he could turn this war into, again, a civil war, of course, against Chiang Kai-shek's forces once Japan withdrew. And he had financial support and arms from the Soviet Union all along. In fact, what was a little bit odd about the Chinese Civil War from the kind of broader geopolitical perspective is that it coincided with the onset of the Cold War in Europe, when the so-called Truman Doctrine, this is when the U.S. agrees it will start supporting, as they put it, free peoples, maybe a little bit of humbug, but the idea is they're supporting governments that are trying to struggle against communist subversion and so forth. So they support Greece and Turkey in the initial case, and then of course eventually they bankroll and support the NATO alliance and all the rest, while the US is making these kind of commitments to stop the spread of communism in Europe. The US is abandoning Chiang Kai-shek in China. They actually cut him off of all arms and all funds, whereas the Soviets were not just sharing and funding Mao, but they were kind of stepping things up. They had established contact in Manchuria. They even gave Mao a lot of the arms that they took from the kind of retreating Japanese armies after the war. And so Mao is now fighting this one-sided proxy war where he's getting everything he needs from the Soviets. So, again, it's sure, Mao had his own peculiar fanaticism that obviously allowed him to kind of inspire people in China, but it's still part of this broader story where you have the Soviet Union, which is kind of arming its client states. And then that's, largely what the rest of the Cold War is about. You have these odd sort of anomalies in a place like Cuba, where Fidel Castro might not have been an orthodox communist. And in fact, even officially, this is a little odd, people might be surprised to learn, officially in the Cold War, Cuba was non-aligned. Theoretically, Cuba was not an aligned country, but of course, in practice, he was a Soviet client, and the Soviets were sending him advisors, aid, missiles, money, etc. I mean, by the late 1980s, the Soviets are actually propping up his government to the tune of almost $5 billion a year, which is a huge amount of money in the 1980s in the communist bloc. And that's part of the reason why Cuba's economy collapsed after the fall of the Soviet Union, because they lost their subsidies. So, Soviet funding and arming was hugely important. And that's really mostly how communism spread, along with opportunities presented by these civil wars. Unfortunately, whenever there was civil war, mayhem, or, growing out of a world war, violence, death, destruction, this helped augur well for the fortunes of communism, because that's basically how communism spreads.
So let me ask you now then about the fall of communism. Why and how did so many communist regimes fall between 1989 and 1991?
Well, it's a great question, and to be honest, we don't have the full story yet. Like, we have a lot more than we did 20 or 30 years ago, but obviously there are a lot of files we still don't have access to. The role of Mikhail Gorbachev is huge. This is the last, of course, general secretary and then later president, kind of a self-styled president of the Soviet Union, who later on became a figure almost of sympathy in the West, I think in part because the Cold War seemed to end without at least a great power conflagration, even if there was a lot of kind of small, seemingly harmless figure hawking Pizza Hut and other kind of Western, is because he needed the money. The thing people forget about Gorbachev is when he first came to power in 1985, the Cold War was actually at a very kind of tense moment, and he was absolutely not installed in power in order to preside over the demise of the Soviet Union. It was not his goal. In fact, the goal even had a new 5-year plan. It was the so-called 12th 5-year plan, Uskorenia. This is the kind of the catchword, which is acceleration. In the U.S., the Reagan administration had, of course, been basically spending a lot more both on the conventional military and talking about this thing called Strategic Defense Initiative, or missile defense, which had put a lot of pressure on the Soviets strategically. The U.S. had been backing initially mostly through Pakistan, but then a little bit more and more directly in the 1980s, the Afghan resistance, Mujahideen, various factions fighting against the Soviet puppet communist government of Afghanistan, which had been installed and then propped up by a kind of Soviet armed coup in 1979. The Soviets had gotten sucked into Afghanistan and were kind of being bled there increasingly by this U.S. armed resistance that had things like Stinger missiles that they could use to shoot down Soviet helicopter gunships. So things were very tense. There had been a few moments in 1982 and 1983, so-called Able Archer kind of episode when there had almost been a scare of kind of nuclear war. There was a whole nuclear freeze movement in Europe. So things were very tense. And Gorbachev did not come to power to preside over surrendering the Cold War. What happened instead was a massive Soviet arms buildup to counter Reagan's arms buildup. And in a lot of conventional categories, another thing I don't think people realize about the Gorbachev era and the so-called perestroika or reconstruction that he talked about, is that the Soviets were actually succeeding in terms of hardware. They were actually outproducing the West, outproducing the US in a lot of categories, self-propelled artillery, tanks, even nuclear submarines, yes, missiles. They were actually outproducing the US in terms of hardware. The problem for the Soviet economy was that basically they were being bankrupted by the effort by this 12 five-year plan. And yes, the consumer economy, and everyone knows this part, was sort of rubbish. It was failing. They were failing to keep up in IT and computers. The consumer sector was perishingly weak. All that was true. But the main problem wasn't necessarily that, let's say, Soviets didn't have enough kind of soap and toilet paper, even though that was probably true. The main problem was that the government was increasingly becoming bankrupt. There was also a lot of financial pressure being put by the Reagan administration. One of the various ways in which they did this was by basically putting a lot of pressure on the energy sector, because the Soviets they relied so much on energy exports. And so the Reagan administration leaned on Saudi Arabia. They ramped up production. Oil prices cratered. This kind of hit the Soviet bottom line. So by about 1989, again, the sort of the happier part of the story is, eventually you see in Eastern Europe, you get the opening of the border between Hungary and Austria. You get the emergence of solidarity in Poland. You get the fall of the Berlin Wall. The happiest, supposedly, story is the so-called Velvet Revolution in Prague. And, all that was fine. But the backdrop of all this, the reason the satellites were able eventually to spin free, was because the Soviets were increasingly bankrupt and they were desperate for Western loans. It gets to a point in 1990 where Gorbachev is actually begging for dollars at these summits with U.S. President George Bush, the first Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, literally begging for dollars. I mean, it's almost kind of embarrassing to read the transcripts of just how desperate Gorbachev was. He wanted the U.S. to give him $50 billion or $100 billion, basically just so that he could afford to prop up what was left of the Soviet security establishment. Because, yes, there were some kind of centrifugal forces. There were movements in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, more importantly in the Baltic states, where these kind of national movements had emerged. And they simply couldn't afford it all. They couldn't afford the Afghan war, but also holding on to the Baltics and here and there, and also spending for the arms buildup. It was a kind of a triage. And meanwhile, at some point, a lot of Soviet insiders must have realized which way the wind was blowing. And so they started laundering funds. We know a lot of kind of KGB people who had access to funds. It really is quite an amazing story. And again, we by no means could we understand the full extent of it. We know, for example, that the Soviet gold reserves vanished. They just disappear. We know that vast amounts of kind of the cash holdings of the Soviet Central Bank, they all disappear in just the course of several years. And the part of the story a lot of people in the rest of the world were familiar with, suddenly you have all these Russian oligarchs showing up, with their yachts and all the rest of it. Where do they come from? Well, sure, some of them were business people who maybe had export or import licenses, or they exported oil, or they imported some product and sold it. A lot of them were just kind of cashing in on the old connections. They were like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Now maybe Gorbachev could have held it together. Maybe better leadership might have allowed them to endure. There are a lot of people who have investigated this and said that Gorbachev made humongous mistakes. And one of the mistakes he actually made, and I talk about this in the book, is that it's a bit like what happens in 1917 in Russia, when I talked about Kerensky losing the support of the officers with the so-called Kornilov affair. During some of the episodes in which the Soviet security forces, and in some cases actually literally the army, is cracking down on dissent and protests, places like Almaty and places like Tbilisi and places like Riga and places like Vilnius, they were doing this and they were basically succeeding. I mean, this is a fearsome apparatus we're talking about, but Gorbachev actually kind of held some of the generals to account. He called them out by name in public, and he embarrassed them, and he accused them of basically killing people, even though he was the one who gave the orders. I mean, it was all, he wanted to be loved and liked. You could, some of this you need to read Machiavelli, I think, to understand. In the end, of course, he ended up being neither loved nor feared, and so he lost the support of the officers. So what happens in the 91 coup, which is a complicated story, but part of what happens is that, again, whether it was Gorbachev or the men he appointed, Gorbachev's role is still a little bit murky in the story of this thwarted coup. And Yeltsin famously stands in the tank and talks about this anti-democratic, right-wing, anti-constitutional coup d'état. Right-wing being ironic because, of course, it was a kind of the communists trying to go back to power. Well, in the army mutiny. So it was yet again a story of mutiny. And I think a lot of the world can be very fortunate that the Soviet army, particularly with its vast nuclear arsenal, didn't go down fighting in this way, and that Yeltsin was able to secure the nuclear arsenal, most of it anyway, and secure the codes and so on and so forth. And Yeltsin turned out to be very kind of pro-West. Of course, a lot of Russians today think he was on the Western payroll or something, but Gorbachev basically kind of misplayed everything. And again, it seemed like a very salutary ending to a lot of people in the West at the time. And obviously, it was great for the peoples of Eastern Europe that were allowed to spin free. I mean, a lot of that was negotiated, too. The Soviets negotiated in exchange for withdrawing troops from East Germany and other countries. They got a little bit of financial compensation, probably not as much as others, people I think Gorbachev would have liked, but it was kind of almost like bribery. The Soviets withdrew. And so, in that sense, communism vanished simply because the sword is lifted, both in the satellite countries and then in Russia. Of course, the opposite happens in China, Tiananmen Square, and that's another story. But there, the communist regime, under a lot of pressure with mass protest building, with the cameras rolling, decides, well, you know what? Unlike Gorbachev, I'm fine with not being loved. And this is kind of Deng Xiaoping and a couple of his top advisors. And they decide, no, it's fine. We will shed blood and we will fire on the protesters. And that, in the end, was what Gorbachev, I suppose, just didn't have the stomach to do. And so a lot of people could be fortunate for this, although obviously in the ensuing chaos, a lot of other people suffered.
Okay, so I'm getting a little bit mindful of your time, so let me just combine two questions here to wrap up our conversation. What is then the second rise of communism that you refer to in the book? How has it played out? And how popular would you say is communism nowadays?
Well, it's a good question. So, I mean, there's several different levels I think we're talking about here. Maybe you could talk several different stories that are interrelated, but they're not all exactly the same. I mean, so in the most literal sense, you have in Russia the endurance of the Communist Party. Unlike, let's say, in 1945, when with Hitler's death, Nazism just kind of disappears from the world, even if people are always talking about neo-Nazism or Nazi that, there's no such thing. The party doesn't exist. There's no real kind of cause. There's no real organization. The Communist Party endured in Russia. In fact, there was a trial in 1992, and at the time it was covered a little bit like, oh, here's a Nuremberg for communism. And, there were these truth and reconciliation commissions in countries like East Germany, where they were actually reckoning with the Stasi, the secret police, and what they had done, and people could go and investigate the files and all this. People were hoping the same thing would happen in Russia, this reckoning. People would be reminded or exposed for the first time to all the crimes committed in the Stalin era or under Brezhnev or under Lenin. And there's a little bit of that. And even in the trial, there was some discussion of some of the crimes of the Communist Party. The part of the story I think we missed, maybe we misunderstood at the time, or maybe we misremembered later, is that the trial was actually caused by a lawsuit filed by the Communist Party, which sued Boris Yeltsin's government for outlawing it. And the communists won the trial. That is, Yeltsin was trying to ban them on the grounds they weren't really a political party, but this kind of criminal structure fusing with state organs, which in a way is right. They kind of are a little bit of both. The communists won the case. And this isn't totally surprising because most of those who were sitting in judgment were themselves communists. Even Yeltsin himself was a lifelong communist. I mean, nearly everyone in the Russian political establishment, including Putin, of course, they were all communists. I mean, that's kind of what you would expect. They grew out of a communist system. And so even if they may no longer have wanted the government to practice the same policies as the Soviet Union, they didn't really want a full reckoning either. And so the opening of the archives for a little while in the early 90s kind of slowed down, and in recent years it's gone into reverse. Even with some such things as like the Katyn Forest Massacre of 1940, which during the Cold War, the Soviets always insisted was a Nazi crime. They finally owned up to this in 1990. Putin even issued a kind of groveling, but not really totally sincere apology for it in 2009 to Poland. Now, again, they're asserting that it either didn't happen or it wasn't us. Like there's been a reversion. There's been a kind of backsliding. Now, the broader story, I suppose China is the most obvious refutation of the idea that communism perished or communism died. The CCP is still in power in China. True, their policies, some people might say, well, you have private property in China and you have these vast fortunes and you have these people who seem like entrepreneurs. Well, yeah, sure. There are certain, you might say, violations of some precise dictionary definition of communism requiring the full state ownership of all the means of production. But this was always true of all communist regimes. It was true at the height of Stalinism. It was true at the height of Maoism. The communists have never fully succeeded in eradicating all of private property because that's basically impossible. You're always going to have some type of a black market. People will always have some private property that the state cannot confiscate, even if it might try to do so and aspires to do so. And even at the height of, let's say, the 5-year plans under Stalin, the Soviets were still employing and contracting with a lot of Western firms to do business in Russia. I mean, a lot of the blast factories were designed by American capitalist firms and so on. And so that level of kind of almost collaboration or tolerance of Western capitalist firms doing business in communist China and then communist versions of these firms, that's always kind of been the case. The difference is still that the state in China still has the final say on everything. The state can basically decide, no, that's not allowed. We're going to confiscate your property or we're going to put you in jail. The state still has the final word and the state still controls. And this is maybe to me kind of the real essence of it. Yes, communist regimes always aspired to abolish private property. They aspired to enroll all economic activity into the hands of the state. They never fully succeeded. Where they did succeed, the statist aspect was in terms of communication and surveillance. That is nothing outside the state. This kind of a more extreme version of how Mussolini actually defined fascism, that the state controls all. And so the state surveils, the state controls your movements, what you're allowed to say. You have kind of censorship communication. And that's what you obviously have in China. Social credit system. The state can determine whether or not you're going to succeed in life, get into schools, get jobs. If you run afoul of the state, they can either arrest you, send you into these kind of forced labor camps or prisons, expel you, or of course, in extreme cases, kill you. And that's still true in China. No other political parties are allowed. That's obviously kind of also part of the essence of communism. And you still have other communist countries today too, Laos, Cambodia, North Korea. Again, to some extent, Cuba. It's a little bit debatable, even to some extent, Cambodia. But in all of these countries, political opposition parties are not allowed. You have a totalitarian single-party state. Now, do we have that in the West? No, not exactly. What we have instead are elements that I think should concern us. We learned a lot in the last 5 years in particular, in the COVID era, but not just the COVID era, about social credit systems, social media censorship, governments increasingly almost working hand in glove with private firms to monitor our communication. Some of this is our own fault, of course, for uploading our private data onto social media accounts. But I mean, in some ways, you might say that the dictators in the kind of classic Cold War era of communism, whether in the Soviet Union or China or the Eastern European satellites, they could have only dreamed of having the tools at their disposal that modern states do to track the movement of people, through these little devices we carry around in our pockets, with all of the CCTVs monitoring our movements, with even people uploading pictures and videos of themselves so that the states can actually basically keep track of us at all times. I think had the Soviets had those tools at their disposal, they may not have gone bankrupt trying to spy on and oppress their citizens. I mean, I suppose we can be fortunate that the Soviets under Brezhnev and then Andropov and Chernenko and Gorbachev didn't have those tools available. If they did, I think the Soviets would still be in power today. So I think we have to watch it. We have to be very careful. We have to protect our freedoms vigorously. And we have to obviously watch out for this idea that there's only one right way of thinking, that there's only one legitimate political party, that anyone who opposes the consensus on some hot button topic should be ostracized and canceled. I mean, all of these things are things that we've seen in a lot of Western countries over the past few years. I mean, famous examples of people being arrested for social media posts. or social media accounts being shut down. These might be softer versions, but they all have echoes, I think, in communist history, whether of Mao's great proletarian cultural revolution or the social credit system under the Soviets. And I think we all need to be on our guard to protect our freedoms.
Great. So the book is again To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. Of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. McMeekin, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, my books are all available through reputable booksellers, including Amazon, although, of course, most of us would probably prefer that you buy them direct from the publisher, which is Basic Books in the case of this book and many of my other books. So Basic Books, you can go to their website. I don't really maintain an active social media account. I'm a little bit wary of the same type of government surveillance, but my literary agent, Andrew Lowney, he does have a website. This is Lownie, and you can Google my name, McMeekin and Lowney, and the books will all come up along with information about which editions are available in translation in which countries. That's all centrally collected on my author page at lowney.net. And so I hope that people will obviously read the books, and I welcome your comments, and I welcome any conversation that arises from them. This has been great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo. Yep.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.